40 years on this bench have shown me a great deal. Wealthy people striding in as though the room already belongs to them. Powerful people attempting to use their titles as armor against accountability. But what entered my courtroom on the morning of November 14th at exactly 10:30 was something I had genuinely never encountered before. A 32-year-old man who had shoved a 71-year-old Vietnam veteran to the ground in broad daylight, and who now stood before me with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face that communicated his full expectation of walking right back out the same way he had come in. And somewhere in the back of that courtroom, seated in plain civilian clothing, was his father, a man who carried a badge, a reputation, and 35 years of service to this city. What that father chose to do next brought every sound in that room to a complete stop. The case file my clerk had placed on my desk that morning carried its own weight before I had read a single line. She handed it to me with the particular look she produces when a case has already reached the local news before it arrives at my bench. I read it twice before I put on my robe. State versus Marcus Holt, case number 2024-C-4417. Assault and battery on an elderly person. The defendant was Marcus Holt, age 32. The victim was James Calloway, age 71, a Vietnam veteran, a retired high school history teacher, a grandfather of 4, a man who had completed 2 tours in the Mekong Delta so that people like Marcus Holt could live in a country where the law is supposed to mean something. Let me tell you who James Calloway is before I tell you what happened that morning in the park. In cases of this kind, the full picture matters. Not because some victims deserve more protection than others. Every human being stands equal before the law in this room, but because the complete weight of what was done to James Calloway cannot be understood without understanding the life that was endangered. James enlisted at 18 years old in 1971. He served with the 101st Airborne Division through 2 full tours. He came home with a Purple Heart and a permanent limp in his left leg that never fully healed. After leaving the military, he spent 30 years teaching high school history in a public school in the city where he had grown up. He coached baseball on weekends. He volunteered at the Veterans Support Center every Tuesday. Every morning at 8:15, he walked his dog, an aging golden retriever named Sergeant, through Riverside Park. That walk was his routine, his peace, the small corner of the world that belonged entirely to him. On November 11th, Veterans Day, Marcus Holt was driving his black Mercedes through the park road at more than 50 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. Sergeant pulled toward the road. James stepped to the curb and raised his hand, the universal signal. Slow down, just slow down. Marcus did not slow down. He stopped. He put the car in park. He stepped out onto the pavement. He walked directly to James Calloway and shoved that 71-year-old man with enough force to send him to the ground, where he did not get back up on his own. James suffered a fractured wrist, 2 bruised ribs, and a severe concussion. He spent 3 nights in the hospital. When the paramedics arrived, he was still on the ground attempting to push himself upright, too proud to remain flat on his back in a public place. 3 witnesses called emergency services. All 3 gave the same account. Marcus Holt stood over James where he lay and spoke words I want you to hear precisely as they were recorded. Next time, old man, keep your hands to yourself. My father runs this city. You have no idea who you just messed with. Then he returned to his Mercedes and drove away. Marcus Holt walked into my courtroom as though the space had been reserved for him. Expensive charcoal suit. A watch that cost more than most people earn in a month. His attorney, a private defense lawyer I had seen maneuver wealthy clients out of difficult corners before, walked half a step behind him like a trained shadow. The attorney carried a leather portfolio thick enough to suggest his client intended to dispute everything, argue everything, and outlast everything through procedure and paperwork. That is the strategy when the facts are not working in your favor. Marcus did not appear nervous. He appeared inconvenienced. The way a person looks when summoned to a meeting they did not request and do not intend to stay for any longer than absolutely necessary. He scanned the courtroom with mild interest, as though calculating whether anything in the room was worth his time. He did not look at James Calloway, not once. James was seated in the front row of the gallery in his best clothes. His wrist was still in a brace. His Purple Heart was pinned to his lapel. And Marcus Holt, the man who had put him on the ground on Veterans Day, could not bring himself to look in his direction. That told me everything I needed to know before the hearing had properly begun. I called the case. Marcus stood. His attorney stood beside him. When I asked Marcus how he pleaded, his attorney stepped forward immediately. "Not guilty, Your Honor. We believe the evidence is circumstantial and the witnesses are inconsistent." I looked past the attorney directly at Marcus. "Mr. Holt," I said, "I asked you, do you have a voice?" He met my eyes with the smirk still holding. "Not guilty." "Thank you," I said. "Now let us talk about what took place on November 11th. I asked the officer to present the evidence. Officer Patricia Ewan, badge number 2218, walked the court through the complete timeline with the precision of someone who has done this work many times. She presented the emergency call logs, the witness statements, the hospital medical report, and then the moment Marcus's attorney shifted noticeably in his seat. She presented parking lot security footage from the recreational center adjacent to the park, crystal clear, full color, a timestamp visible on screen. We played it on the courtroom monitor. The entire gallery watched in silence as Marcus Holt's Mercedes appeared, moving at a speed that was visibly absurd for that road. James Calloway raising his hand. Marcus stopping, stepping out, walking directly toward James with his shoulders set and his expression hard. The shove that sent a decorated veteran with a damaged leg straight to the ground. Marcus standing over him, gesturing, getting back in the car and driving away. The courtroom remained silent for a full 3 seconds after the footage ended. Not the restless silence of an uninterested room, the held-breath silence of people who have just witnessed something they cannot look away from. I looked at Marcus. "Still not guilty, Mr. Holt?" He shrugged. He actually shrugged and said, he stepped into the road. Someone in the gallery exhaled audibly. James Calloway sat perfectly still in the way men of that generation sit when they have learned across a long life that composure is its own form of authority. I leaned forward. "Mr. Holt," I said, "I have occupied this bench for 4 decades. I have seen defendants construct lies with considerable skill. What I just watched on that screen was not a reaction. It was a decision. You placed your car in park. You walked toward a 71-year-old man. You made a deliberate choice. So I am going to ask you again. Would you like to reconsider your characterization of what happened on Veterans Day?" His attorney placed a hand on Marcus's arm. Marcus pulled his arm away. And then he said something that dropped the temperature in that room by 10 degrees. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady and flat, as though explaining something obvious to someone slow, "My father has served this city for 35 years. He is the chief of police. I think it is fair to say I understand law enforcement, and I understand what constitutes an actual threat. That man was in the road. I protected myself, and I moved on. The fact that I am even standing here is an embarrassment." The gallery did not gasp. It went quiet in a way that is considerably louder than gasping. I removed my glasses. Anyone familiar with my courtroom understands what that means. "An embarrassment," I repeated. "Mr. Holt, do you know who James Calloway is?" He glanced at James for the first time. A single dismissive look. "No." I stood up from the bench. I stepped down to the front of the room. "James Calloway," I said, "would you please stand?" He rose slowly, and with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned not to trust his joints without consideration. He stood straight. He looked at me and waited. "Mr. Calloway," I said, "would you please tell this court who you are?" James Calloway cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "My name is James Calloway," he said. "I served in the United States Army, 101st Airborne Division, from 1971 to 1973. 2 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart. I taught history at Jefferson High for 30 years. I have 4 grandchildren. I walk my dog in that park every morning because it is the only hour I have to myself since my wife passed away 2 years ago." He paused. And on Veterans Day, I asked a man to slow down near the road because I did not want my dog to get hit. And he put me on the ground. The courtroom was absolutely still. I turned back to Marcus Holt. Do you understand what you just heard? You shoved a decorated combat veteran, a man who risked his life for this country, a man who spent 3 decades educating children in this city, a man who was walking his dog on Veterans Day. You put him on the ground and described it as a reaction. I looked at him for a long moment. You are 32 years old. You should be ashamed of yourself. The smirk finally left his face. His jaw tightened. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered. Marcus leaned away from him instead and looked directly at me. Your Honor, he said, my father will be speaking with the district attorney's office about this case. I think you should be aware of that. And there it was. The line that explains why this case reached the news. The line that brought this story into this room. I said, Mr. Holt, are you attempting to inform me that your father's position will influence how I conduct this hearing? He held my gaze. I am just saying he knows people. I looked out at the gallery. Chief Holt, I said, would you please come forward? The entire room turned around. In the last row, a man stood. Late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a plain button-down shirt and slacks, no uniform, no badge. Chief Raymond Holt had been seated there from the beginning of the hearing. He had heard every word his son had spoken. He had watched the footage. He had sat through the dismissal of James Calloway's service and his dignity. And the expression on his face as he walked down the center aisle was not anger. It was something considerably harder to carry. It was grief. Marcus turned slowly. His face moved through 3 expressions in approximately 2 seconds. Confusion, then a brief flicker of relief, then something close to fear when he read what was on his father's face. Dad, he said, what are you? Chief Holt raised one hand. Marcus stopped speaking immediately. Chief Holt, I said, thank you for being here. I understand this is not easy. Your son has told this court on multiple occasions that your position and your relationships will influence the outcome of this case. I would like to give you an opportunity to speak to that directly. Chief Raymond Holt stood at attention. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but I could hear what maintaining that steadiness was costing him. Your Honor, he said, my son is wrong. He has always been wrong about that. I have spent 35 years serving this city. I have placed people in handcuffs who wore the same badge I wear. I built my career on a single idea, that no one is above the law, and that includes my family. He stopped. He looked at Marcus. That includes you. Marcus opened his mouth. Marcus, one word. It was enough. Chief Holt turned back to me. I watched the footage this morning before I came here, Your Honor. I have read the medical report. I know what my son did to Mr. Calloway. And I am here today not as Chief Holt. I am here as a father who failed to teach his son the most important lesson I know, that a badge, whether it is mine or merely the idea of mine, is not a shield against consequences. It is a responsibility to uphold them. His voice cracked slightly on that last sentence. He pulled it back. I am asking you, he continued, to give this man the full weight of what the law provides. Do not reduce it because of my name. Do not adjust it because of my years of service. James Calloway served this country. He spent 30 years educating children in this city. And on Veterans Day, my son put him on the ground and drove away. That deserves a real consequence. He paused. And what he said next is something I will carry with me until the day I step down from this bench. If anything, I am asking you to be harder on him than you would otherwise be, because he needs to understand that my position has never been his to use. And today is the day he learns that. Marcus looked like someone had removed the floor from beneath him. He was 32 years old, standing in his expensive suit, and for the first time in his life, the name was not going to work. He turned to his father. His voice was very small. Dad. Chief Holt looked at his son. Marcus, he said, be quiet. Listen, I have occupied this bench for a very long time. I have observed 1,000 variations of human nature present themselves in this room. But a father standing in open court and asking me to hold his own son fully accountable, that I had never seen before. I have watched fathers plead with me to go easy. I have watched fathers shake their heads and leave the room. I have watched fathers who never came at all. But I had never seen a father walk to the front of a courtroom, look directly at the damage his son had done and say, "Give him everything the law allows." And I want you to understand what it takes to stand there and say that. That man loved his son. You could hear it in the places where his voice nearly failed him. You could see it in the way he looked at Marcus when Marcus went quiet. But he loved justice more. He loved James Calloway's right to walk his dog in the park without being knocked to the ground more than he loved the comfort of letting his name do the work that evidence should not. He loved the 35 years he had spent building something honest more than he loved the 10 seconds it would take to let his position shield his son from the outcome that was rightfully his. That is what integrity actually costs when it is real. I looked at James Calloway, still seated quietly in the front row. "Mr. Calloway," I said, "do you wish to address the court?" He stood again. He placed his good hand on the rail. "Your Honor," he said, "I do not want revenge. I want this young man to understand that the people around him, the strangers in the park, the teachers who stood in front of his classroom, the veterans who walk the same streets he drives through at 50 miles an hour, we all deserve to be treated as though we are worth something. I came here today because I believe the law still means something, and because I want my grandchildren to live in a world where it does." The room remained silent for a long moment after he sat back down. Then I turned to Marcus Holt and I gave him the sentence. "Marcus Holt, on the charge of assault and battery on an elderly person, I find you guilty. Your actions on November 11th were not a reaction. They were a decision. And that decision put a decorated veteran in a hospital bed for 3 nights. Here is what this court orders: 120 days in the county correctional facility, suspended pending full compliance with the following conditions: 200 hours of community service to be completed at the Veterans Support Center, where James Calloway volunteers every Tuesday. You will not be seated behind a desk. You will work alongside the veterans there. You will hear their stories. You will carry their equipment. You will assist with whatever they require. You will complete 1 full year of anger management counseling, documented and reviewed by this court. You will compose a formal letter of apology to James Calloway to be read aloud in this courtroom at your compliance review. And you will speak to the Police Academy's incoming recruit class about privilege, accountability, and what becomes of a person who believes their family name places them beyond the reach of consequence. Your father will arrange it." Marcus stared at the floor. I leaned forward one final time. "Mr. Holt," I said, "look at me." He looked up. "You walked into this courtroom this morning believing a name would protect you. Your father just demonstrated that names protect no one. Service does. Character does. The choices a person makes when they are being watched, and more importantly, the choices they make when they believe they are not. Look at your father. That is the standard a name is supposed to represent. Begin working on becoming that." As the bailiff moved to process the paperwork, Chief Holt crossed the room to where James Calloway was seated. He extended his hand. James looked at it for a moment, just a moment, and then shook it. The chief said something I could not fully hear from the bench, but James nodded slowly, and I could see the beginning of something that might, given enough time, become forgiveness. Not for Marcus, for the situation, for the fact that a good man had spent Veterans Day on the ground because someone had grown up believing that a name was a license. Marcus watched his father from across the room. He was crying. Not the calculated production of tears that defendants sometimes offer when a sentence becomes real. The genuine kind. The kind that arrives when a person finally grasps something they should have understood long before this moment. He was 32 years old, and for the first time in his life, the scaffolding had come down completely. The name, the connections, the assumption that consequences were something reserved for other people, all of it gone. What remained was simply a man who had hurt someone who did not deserve to be hurt, standing in a courtroom where his father had just chosen justice over him. That is a hard thing to witness. I will not pretend otherwise. I have never found satisfaction in this part of the work, but I believe in it. I have believed in it across 4 decades. 6 months later, Marcus Holt completed his first 100 hours at the Veteran Support Center. His supervisor there, a woman named Carol Deans, who had been running that center for 18 years, submitted a report to the court. She wrote that in the beginning, he arrived with the posture of someone who believed the room was beneath him. He stood near the door. He answered questions with as few words as possible. He completed the minimum of what was required and nothing beyond it. By the 4th week, something shifted. She was not entirely certain what produced the change. Perhaps a particular conversation. Perhaps the accumulated weight of being consistently surrounded by men who had given everything and received very little in return. He began staying an extra hour each Tuesday to sit with veterans who had no family visiting them. He began arriving early. He began learning names. By the 3rd month, he knew every man in that center by name, by branch, and by the year he had served. He remembered who preferred their coffee with 2 sugars. He remembered which men needed help navigating their paperwork and which men simply needed someone to sit quietly beside them without expectation. Carol Deans wrote, "I do not know what happened to this young man in a courtroom, but whatever it was, it worked." James Calloway wrote me a letter. He described Marcus finding him on a Tuesday afternoon. They sat together on a bench outside the center. Marcus apologized, not the version prepared by attorneys, not the performance of remorse, the real thing. James said it took Marcus about 15 minutes to get through it because he kept stopping, and James let him stop. And then James told Marcus about Vietnam, about what it feels like to come home to a country that was not entirely sure it wanted you back, about learning to locate your peace in small things, a morning walk, a good dog, a park you know well enough to feel at home in. James wrote at the end of his letter, "I think that young man is going to be all right. I think his father's choice that day was the best thing that ever happened to him. And I think my dog would have liked him." I will never forget that sentence. I will never forget Chief Holt walking down that center aisle. I will never forget James Calloway standing with his brace and his Purple Heart and his quiet voice that carried across a silent room. I will never forget that the law, applied with both firmness and dignity, can accomplish something a prison sentence alone never could. It can change a person. It does not always. I want to be honest about that. Not every Marcus Holt becomes the person who stays late to sit with veterans. Some of them leave the courtroom and return to exactly who they were, but some do not. And that possibility that a single moment of genuine accountability can redirect a life is why I continue to put this robe on every morning. My father came to this country with nothing. He worked construction. He used to say that the law is the great equalizer, the one place where a man with no resources and a man with every advantage in the world stand on the same ground. He believed that without reservation. I have spent my career attempting to make it true, not merely as a stated principle, but as a daily practice. Cases like this one remind me that it is possible, that when a father chooses honor over protection, when a veteran stands with a brace on his wrist and speaks with grace instead of anger, when a young man who believed he was untouchable finally sits with the full weight of what he has done, the law can become what it was always supposed to be. The lesson here is not the dramatic instant when Chief Holt walked down that aisle. It is not the sentence. It is not even the footage. The lesson is that the most powerful force in any courtroom is not the gavel. It is character. It is the choice every person makes about who they intend to be when the moment arrives that genuinely tests them. James Calloway had that character. He walked in with his brace and his Purple Heart and his quiet dignity and told a room full of strangers that he did not want revenge. He wanted understanding. Chief Raymond Holt had that character. He walked in knowing what it would cost him, and he did it regardless. And Marcus Holt, I believe, is learning it late and painfully, but learning it nonetheless. In my experience, that is enough. In my experience, that is everything.